All right, so hi everybody. My name is Clayton Hayes. I'm a librarian here at Wayne State, and I am kicking off our programming for Open Access Week with a presentation about the history of open access. The title, Letting the Foxes Guard the Henhouse, kind of my nod to, is that an aphorism, a fable, whatever, about for-profit publication organizations and the open access movement, and kind of looking at the history of that. If you have any questions at any point, I'm going to do my best to have a look at the chat every so often. I think the way that I have it set up, it'll pop up, or at least let me see that someone is saying something in the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask a question, that's fine too. I will say I can't get my speaker notes to show up in the presentation. I'm remembering now that I had the same problem the last time I gave this presentation and never got around to fixing it. So, but I did okay last time, and hopefully I won't forget too much this time. So, that being said, I'm gonna get started. There we go. So yeah, feel free to interrupt. Kind of covered that a second ago. I will be providing a list of resources at the end. I don't really have like in-text citations or anything like that. It was just kind of too much work for me to try and figure that all out. But I do have a collection of resources at the end. I'm happy to make these slides available. I'll probably get a PDF put together that'll be sent out with the recording, which we usually do after the fact. I can put my email in the chat too for anybody who wants to get a copy of the slides. This is only slated for an hour, so it is going to be oversimplified. Anytime you're trying to cover an entire industry, you gotta simplify things a little bit. So I apologize for that. But I don't think I have much choice. And I will say that another librarian, Dave Gamandi, who works in Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to look again. I can't remember. Somewhere East Coasty, he gave a presentation about transformative agreements at this year's Library Publishing Forum, and that kind of broadly inspired my thinking here. So as far as the contents go, my plan is to talk about our narrative of open access, our being librarians, how we think about open access and how it's taught to us. And yeah, I thought Virginia. Cheryl put in the chat that he said UVA. Thank you, Cheryl. So our narrative, the library narrative of open access, the counter narrative that exists of corporate open access, and kind of how those two things are in opposition to each other. What I see as the scholarly publishing landscape that has resulted from this, the counter narrative of corporate open access, and maybe a little bit from librarians' lack of recognition of the counter narrative of corporate open access, and then maybe a couple thoughts on ways forward. Although anytime I've tried to put those together, it hasn't gone super well. I don't have answers, unfortunately. I don't have a lot of answers, at least. But I'm not the only one, so I take comfort in that a little bit. So the narrative that we tell ourselves about open access, and I am speaking specifically about librarians, but I think this is I think it's important because I think it's the way that librarians who are heavily involved in open access think that everybody else sees open access. I think we have this perception that everybody else sees it the same way we do. So I think it's important to kind of get a sense of that. So the open access movement, as we understand it, kind of began with this statement from the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002. And I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but it kind of sets out what is defined by open access, free availability to the public over the internet. And the full text of it is still available. I got an email recently, and I'm sure a couple other folks here did too, about the what it would be the 20th anniversary of this statement, and asking for questions about it and statements about it. And I don't know that I didn't volunteer any, because I don't know that they would have liked any of the questions that I had to ask, which we'll get to, I guess, perhaps later. But some specific outcomes that were underlined in this statement were removing access barriers. They said that removing access barriers will accelerate research, enrich education, share the learning of the rich with the poor and the poor with the rich, make this literature as useful as it can be, and lay the foundation for uniting humanity in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge. Very high concept, very lofty goals. But some of what it boils down to is greater equity of access to research for everybody on the planet, at least everybody with an internet connection, and that's something that is addressed in the initiative. But also greater visibility and impact for researchers. So not just these lofty benefits to the world and society and whatnot, but they are addressing the greater impact that researchers might see for their work because it's become more available. And I wanted to mention here that it's important to keep in mind these goals, as they were originally set out as being very, maybe they wouldn't have used the term because I don't know that it was widely used at the time, but very social justice oriented goals for open access. That was kind of the focus, or at least a major part of the focus when this was put out. And so later on, I'll be returning to whether or not I feel it's been successful, the movement as a whole, in addressing these social justice goals. But there were some kind of subtextual outcomes that have either been part of the conversation from the start or have been layered onto the open access movement as it's kind of gained in popularity and awareness. The first being that it was seen as a solution to what we in the library world called the serials crisis, which was kind of well, I have a definition here at the bottom of the slide, that it was a runaway inflation of the cost of subscription academic resources that began in the 90s, that has continued to outpace library budgets and institutional budgets. This is the term kind of came into broad use in the mid to late 90s, but it's I think that generally the perception is that we're still in this, that it hasn't ended. We haven't really seen any change in how these subscription costs are kind of continuing to increase. There's also the goal of placing the control over scholarly publishing into the hands of those that depend on it. So those being faculty at the institutions. I think that there is a fair amount of control in terms of like the day-to-day operation of these scholarly publishing sources, because the editing, peer review, things like that are all handled by faculty. But in terms of the ownership of these entities, for the most part, it's in the hands of scholarly publishers, commercial scholarly publishers for that matter, which we'll talk about again a little bit later. And so shifting that control to institutions that are more, to institutions that are not for profit and are more closely controlled or in closer conversation with the faculty. And then finally, this is one of the more recent developments, but it's a big one here and in Europe, that publicly funded research should be publicly available. So, a lot of the government science funding sources like the NIH and the NSF now have public access requirements for any research that their grants fund. So the way that the open access initiative kind of envisioned implementation of open access was in two kind of, via two different avenues. First, the self-archiving of published or nearly published materials, so that either the final published document is self-archived in some online repository that's openly available, or a version of that article that is very close to publication. And then the second mode was open access journals, journals whose content is all published openly and publicly available out on the internet. And the idea being that they would recoup costs via some means other than restricting access to content. It's a little vague on that point, unfortunately. And as it's kind of developed, the primary way that a lot of open access publications have recouped costs is through what are called APCs. Unfortunately, there's not really a consensus on what APC stands for. Each of the letters is kind of interchangeable. There's a few interchangeable terms. So like article processing charges or author publication costs. Different publishers will kind of swap out individual terms. But generally it is a fee paid by authors so that their article can be published. Usually with the understanding being that it is published open access, although I haven't seen it, but I'm not sure if like other closed publications would use APC as well in some context. I don't know. It's used in the context of paying for open access, essentially. So the general sort of publishing models that exist and are most often referred to are a closed publishing model, a green open access model, and a gold open access model. Those are kind of the three, not the three, well, yes, the three most common, but the ones that are most talked about as well. And so the closed model is the traditional subscription model. And I've got this chart set up so that the first column, there's a little icon with an eyeball and a page of paper, meaning, is there a cost to read the article? And the second column with a little page and a pencil, is there a cost to write or publish the article? So in the closed model, there's no cost to authors to publish the model. The money is coming from people who want to read the article. You have to pay to read the article. Green open access is widely understood to mean there's no cost to publish the article open access or to make it openly available, and there's no cost to individuals who want to read the article as well. Whereas gold open access, there's no cost to people who want to read the article, but there is a cost associated with publishing the article open access. These are the three main kind of models that exist. There's a lot of other like less defined or less like agreed upon models out there. They often have other colors or other like precious material terms associated with them, like diamond open access is a common one, or like platinum. But they're not standard, and I don't know that they're widely understood. I don't think these terms, green and gold, are that widely understood, to be honest. So, tacking on all these extra terms, just serves to further muddy the waters to a certain extent. And I will mention that green open access is often used only in the context of self-archiving, but I kind of think that's silly. I think it should be used for anything that doesn't involve, where payment is not being pushed on the authors or on the readers. So the gold model turned out to be very successful. Two kind of sciencey publications, Public Library of Science and Biomed Central, you may have heard of one or both of these, turned out to be, they were very successful models. Biomed Central began charging $500 per article way back in 2002, like basically right when it started. And since about 2008, I was able to see that Public Library of Science is averaging around 1,000 to 1,500 euro per article is what they're charging authors to publish. A hybrid journal, which is a little bit of a newer sort of model, is a closed publication that will, for a fee, make an article openly available. So that is like a publication in which all the content is has to be paid to be viewed, like on a per article basis. They will make articles openly available, but the authors have to pay a fee in order to make that happen. So it's kind of a piecemeal approach to open access, very intentionally, I think. And kind of the latest development in terms of open access, or one that is getting talked about the most, at least, is what are called transformative agreements, or read and publish, or publish and read agreements. Again, not really, no consensus on the terminology to use, but they all mean more or less the same thing. They're originating from this Max Planck Digital Library article from 2015. But the idea is that the amount of money that's out there being spent on open access, if we could just like take all that money and shift it to existing publishing structures, everything could be open access. So like the idea, I guess, is that if instead of libraries paying for subscriptions to journals, we just paid for APCs for our authors instead, then everything would be open access, which doesn't sound like too out there, I guess, but the implementation has, from what I can see, strayed away from this original idea. Instead, the way that these transformative agreements work now is that publishers and institutions are reaching agreements where the institution pays or subscribes to a bundle of content from the publisher, and on top of that, agrees to pay for APCs for any authors from their institution. So not that the institution is shifting its funding from subscription sources all to APCs. This is some sort of hybrid of the two, or a combination of the two, where we're still paying for subscriptions to the content that exists, but on top of that, also paying for APCs. There are a lot of additional issues with this. First of all, that especially with science articles that have a ton of authors, the publisher may restrict these agreements to just the lead author. And it often applies to only titles, leaving out the more popular or impactful titles. And I think that I was going to also say that I think it comes later. Sorry. So if I had my notes, I would know. So that was kind of the narrative of open access as told by and to librarians. It's kind of the library open access narrative. I think to get a broader view, though, I'm zooming out, and I'm zooming out quite a ways to start out with, all the way back to the Cold War, because that was where I think the Cold War resulted in a huge shift in how higher education works. That being that there was a lot more funding made available from the government to science research, and from other sources as well. But I think the government was a big funder of science research, especially in the Cold War. And so the fact that there was a lot of money in research meant there was a lot of money in publishing that research. It created an industry essentially, and there was a proliferation of scholarly publishers and scholarly publications as a result. A lot of money to be made, so a lot of people out there, trying to provide that service and make that money. Another result was that in the 50s or the 60s and 70s, especially, citation metrics and author metrics became huge as well. That's when we get Science Citation Index and the Web of Knowledge, which have combined and are now owned by Clarivate, who owns like EndNote and other things as well. So that grew into a big big money industry as well. And the kind of like the modern promotion and tenure system in higher education, especially in the sciences, grew over top of this citation and author metric structure that was resulting from the amount of like this huge amount of money that got pushed into institutions as a result of the Cold War. When the internet came around, it allowed publishers it opened up a direct-to-consumer market for scholarly publishers. Before the existence of the internet, most of the selling that scholarly publishers were doing was to institutions or to libraries directly. But with the advent of the internet, these publishers are able to sell individual articles or individual chapters of books directly to consumers without having to go through the institution or through the library. And something that we saw in scholarly publishing that is, has also been seen in a bunch of other industries as well, is that the big publications, the big publishers or the big players in these fields have only gotten bigger. They've bought up, merged with, or absorbed, or driven out of business any of the smaller entities. And so I'm going to mention this a little bit later, but we're kind of left with 5 main scholarly publishers that exist right now. I think there are parallels in more general publishing, but I'm not as familiar with that as an area. So the serials crisis, which I mentioned earlier, kind of this rampant inflation of scholarly subscriptions beginning in the mid to late 90s. My view of what this was, I think that kind of a baseline agreement we all have to start on is that if something is a for-profit entity, their goal is to spend the least amount of money to get the most amount of money. They want to maximize profits as much as possible. That is the nature of being a for-profit entity. There's also the fact that higher ed for scholarly publishers is a captive market. In order for faculty to be promoted and to achieve tenure, they have to publish in scholarly journals or be published through other scholarly publishing avenues, books and whatnot. And in order to do that, those faculty need access to the research that's being produced that's out there. So there is no choice for faculty at institutions. If they want to get promoted and want to get tenure, they have to go to scholarly publishers. That is what I mean when I say that higher ed is a captive market. This kind of led to the big deal as a subscription model, which if you're not familiar with that as a term, it's something that we talk about in libraries a lot, but individual publishers will say, for this amount of money, we'll give you access to this huge bucket of titles. And it's kind of like a cable subscription where you maybe don't necessarily want everything that's in that bucket, but there's no way to, or it'd be prohibitively expensive to subscribe to each individual title on its own. I guess with cable, you can't really do that, or you haven't usually been able to do that. Presumably with scholarly journals, there maybe would be some way of doing that, but it wouldn't be feasible really. I also think that there's a perception, maybe not from individuals working at scholarly publishers, and I don't have any proof to back this up, but if you look at the kind of ebb and flow of scholarly publishing, librarians serve as a sort of middleman in this process. Part of our job is to make informed, critical decisions about the sort of publications that we spend money on. But we are not the primary consumers of that scholarly content. That's faculty, students, grad students, researchers, whatnot. that we work with. So we kind of stand in between the publishers and their users, the kind of end user, and mediate what the institution subscribes to. And that is, I think, not something that scholarly publishers, there's no incentive to scholarly publishers to keep us around, I guess is what I'm saying. You know, I think that they see us as middlemen and possibly as something that, you know, in a perfect world wouldn't exist. And finally, you know, one of the whole things, and I think we've seen this with, the example that comes to mind is cable internet, is that on the part of these for-profit publishers, there's a question of how much is the market going to bear. They will increase costs to the point where, you know, they start seeing a drop off in profits, and it just hasn't got to that point. And there's not necessarily an increase in services that has gone with the inflation in costs. They're just trying to see how much institutions are willing to pay for this stuff. And because faculty need these publications in order to be promoted and to achieve tenure, there is a huge premium put on having these resources. So we have not hit the ceiling just yet, or maybe we have, we've gotten close perhaps. I also think that the early successes of gold journals have kind of tainted the well a little bit from the for-profit perspective. I think initially that the idea of as it gained traction, it was seen as a legitimate threat to traditional publishing. But because the biggest impact was had by these author-paced models, these gold journals like Public Library of Science and Biomed Central, that for-profit publishers saw this not as a threat, but as an opportunity. To the point where, in fact, Biomed Central was acquired by Springer in 2008. And so now it is a part of a for-profit publishing organization. And I will mention that Public Library of Science, which is not for-profit officially, but has been able to recoup all of its costs starting in 2011, just via article processing charges, or APCs. I think that the lesson that for-profit publishers learned from gold journals is that faculty can be taught that open access is transactional. So that in order for open access to happen, somebody has to pay for it at the point of publication, because that is what the gold model is built on. And so we've seen like a huge proliferation in hybrid open access publishing. And I put OA in quotes in this slide intentionally, because I think it is a way for-profit publishers to pay lip service to the idea of open access while they maintain profits from subscription costs and from per article sales, because most of the content that they are putting out there is not open access. And I have a little image here that I got from Elsevier of them kind of touting open access on in 2020, and that in particular, over 90% of their journals offer the option to publish open access, meaning that they will accept money from researchers to publish open access. And so, you know, what to me, this represented a new revenue stream for publishers for which they really didn't have to change any of their process. There was barely any cost that the publishers had to foot to make this happen. And similarly, I think that transformative agreements are just kind of an extension of this same exact model, except for authors, for researchers, there's the perceived benefit that the costs are shifted to the institution. It's no longer the researchers that have to pay, it's now the institution that takes care of that. And so it's easier for authors to swallow this as a model. And I think it's probably a very smart PR move on the part of publishers to recognize that authors are their primary audience and the primary producers of their content. And so they should be doing what they can to make them happy, and putting the pressure on staff at the institution instead. And so what has resulted, I think, is that publishers, who are the primary agents of scholarly publishing that faculty interact with, they are the ones that have gotten to dictate the narrative of open access. And the narrative that they push is that in order to make something open access, in order to make your work open access, you or your institution has to pay for it at the point of publication. And I think that it is, very instructive to look at recent publications in the DOAJ, which is the Directory of Open Access Journals. Only 27% of journals in that directory say that they charge APCs, but 57% of the articles published in DOAJ journals do charge APCs. So even though most of the journals are not charging authors, most of the articles are coming from journals that do charge authors. And kind of as a side note here, I think the public access requirements from the NIH and the NSF have helped to push paid OA a little bit, because it's been pushing authors to select that option. And I think that the way it's presented to authors is that if you want to make something OA first, the first option is to pay for it and make it OA that way. And then also there's this other thing called green open access that you can maybe do, but it's not as good. So I pulled some text from Springer Nature's website about open access. And this is from their information for authors. From their FAQs, if I'm not mistaken. And so, for the FAQ, how can I publish my work open access? The first result is saying, well, you can pay for it. And then, the second paragraph is like, maybe where that's not an option, or there's a traditional subscription model, you can submit your work to an open access repository at some later date. So it's the green option, the option where nobody pays for it, not the readers and not the authors, is presented as kind of the secondary and less good option. And there's even a FAQ further down the line, how do I pay for open access, which, indicates that somebody has to. So the end result of all of this, if we look back at some of the outcomes that were originally laid out in the open access statement at the end of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, was that it was seen as a solution to the serials crisis. And this is something that's continued to be said over and over and over again. I have a quote here from a Library Journal article, which is kind of a trade industry publication for librarians from 2019, saying that recent developments in open access are going to bring major reform to academic publishing. And I think it was speaking specifically about transformative agreements in that case. And another outcome that was hoped for was that it would shift control over publishing into the hands of the people who depend on it, faculty. But neither of those things have happened. Libraries have fought for decades now against the rising costs of subscription resources, but there's no indication that open access has had a significant impact on that inflation. I think partially because publishers have absorbed open access into their day-to-day implementation, and it's been introduced as a new way for publishers to make money. And the production of scholarly content is even more concentrated than it was when that 2002 initiative got put out. As of right now, or as of what the article being published that I got this statistic from, 5 publishers in 3 countries produce over 60% of scholarly published content in the world. So these 5 publishers are responsible for over 60% of scholarly content that's out there. And I think that, faculty, and these represent also kind of the high impact journals that faculty need to publish in order to get promoted and to get tenure. So I don't know, I think there just needs to be some awareness of the fact that these huge multinational for-profit corporations are the ones that all of higher education promotion and tenure is built on top of, that these 5 publishers are in control essentially of promotion and tenure. And yes, that is a simple oversimplification, but you can't argue that the faculty who are involved in peer review or involved in editing journals own what comes out of them. Those things are owned, like the intellectual property, the copyright on articles is for the most part owned by these 5 publishers. And yeah, I will refrain from, I don't know, going off on a tangent too much. But I don't know, I think it's important to note that, yeah, so Cheryl's reaction. Pay to publish OA, I think, undermines the stated goals of open access that were in that foundational document. It has not, it does not, and it will not threaten for-profit publishing. I think it's the best proof of that is that Springer bought Biomed Central after less than a decade, and that it continues to be profitable. Transformative agreements, hybrid journals do not incentivize change on the part of publishers. At their best, they maintain the status quo that already exists, which is 5 publishers being in charge of, the vast majority of content. And at their worst, they're double dipping. They're requiring institutions to pay to read and pay to publish, in order for our faculty to survive. And even self-archiving and public access requirements are piecemeal. They're only addressing things on a article by article basis, and it's not shifting things on a grand scale. And I think one of the biggest problems is that a lot of the open access movement runs into is that there's somehow this expectation that for-profit publishers are going to prioritize anything except for their own profits, which is not what they exist for. The whole purpose of for-profit entities is to maximize their profits as much as they can. And we should understand and expect that. I don't think it necessarily means that they're bad. I personally think that they're bad, but I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. I think that there just needs to be recognition on the part of other people involved in this process that that's what the publishers are going to do, and that we need to address it if higher ed institutions and the people working there are going to survive. Now this isn't working perhaps. These were some numbers about how much money the different publishers are making off of APCs. And these are just, totals that are reported by individuals at different institutions. So, for example, Elsevier making around 50 million euro from APCs. Since this website began keeping track, which is only within the last 10 to 15 years. And I think that it's important. One of the people that I feel it's important to pay attention to when discussing open access and equity, especially, is Reggie Raju, who's at the University of Cape Town Libraries. He's heavily involved in scholarly publishing and its effect on Africa in particularly, as a librarian who works in that context. And his statements about open access and the movement in general are particularly revealing, that the open access movement has betrayed Africa as like a continent, and that open access has moved away from social justice imperatives and equity principles, and is now seen as a process, like a checkbox that gets checked during the publishing process. And this is why I think that if I were to have responded to this call for questions about the Budapest Open Access Initiative, that they maybe wouldn't have wanted to hear what I had to say, because I agree, and I'm going to be continuing to listen to folks like Reggie who, because that I feel like their point of view is one that needs to be highlighted more. I gotta click back on my window. There we go. So now that I've driven everybody but the library people away from this presentation, I think I can talk about ways forward. And I don't know, I believe that as long as commercial and corporate entities are an integral part of publishing in higher ed, nothing is going to change. And their goal is to get the most money for the least service. I think runs counter to the long-term survival of higher ed. I think it definitely runs counter to the existence of libraries, who are seen as we are funds. Our salaries are funds that could be spent uncritically on more content from publishers. So I think that the for-profit publishers would be pretty happy to see libraries and librarians done away with, and to have those funds kind of directed towards resources instead. And the question is, will faculty realize what's happening before libraries and librarians are squeezed out of the process? And will there be recognition that faculty are then going to be the next folks who have the squeeze put on them? Some other kind of stray thoughts that I think we need to be aware of what we're funding. That even if we don't agree with it, that we are to some extent complicit in where our money goes, and the fact that so much of our money gets sent to these huge for-profit publishers as something that we need to grapple with, that we are part of our own problem in that respect. So I think that's more or less it. I have, like I said, a collection of resources that I used in writing this up. But yeah, I'm very curious to hear what thoughts are here. I'll stop sharing, and I mean, I can also stop the recording if anyone would prefer that before talking about it. But yeah, I think it's, I wonder, I didn't recognize any of the names of people that were here and then left, but I do recognize now that we only have library people left. And I appreciate you, I thank you for sticking it out.
Another great presentation, Clayton.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think,
and yeah, I go ahead.
Go ahead, Cheryl. Sorry.
I was going to say, in relation to Karen's comment in the chat, that we started to lose the argument by giving in way back then. Yeah, that's it's hard to change courses even within libraries when we've already, given in.
Well, and I think honestly, authors felt my paper has to be published no matter what, and they were willing basically to give it away, and that's basically what's happened again and again and again and again. And until we can do something, to me, with the promotion and tenure processes that change those values around, I think we're just going to keep perpetuating the same mess unless we can really manage to become wide scale publishers. And I don't know, I don't see that happening. I just don't. Sad, but true.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's interesting that one of the big focuses of, I think when I was in grad school, one of the big focuses of open access was the kind of was author agreements and addressing it at that point, and like having these author agreement, like these addendums that you add on saying, I have the right to deposit this regardless of what you say. And that really is no longer a thing. That's like, I think barely part of the discussion anymore. And I think there was a recognition on the part of libraries that it was a conversation that faculty weren't interested in having with us.
Mhm.
But I agree, until promotion and tenure changes, nothing's going to change, and we are not the people that can change that. None of the people here on this call, for the most part, are people that can change the promotion and tenure process or have any say in that whatsoever, which is unfortunate.
Well, I mean, being voices in that is still important. I think we can keep pointing that out.
Yeah, but
I mean,
they have to
yeah,
listen.
the only interest I've had at all lately in open access is for people contacting me to ask about how can they get their APC charges paid. And I've talked to them till I'm blue in the face about that's not the question you should be asking, number one. And, maybe you should be considering a different publication. But does that go over very well either? No.
Where I have had
So-
success is in terms of individual interventions, which,
Mhm.
the librarians do all day long, like Karen's talking about in that respect. But I do it on Twitter, and anytime I see a scholar post an article and say, oh, go read this in the next issue of, College English or whatever, and it's behind a paywall, and I'm like, here's who you should contact at your university to talk about depositing this in your institutional repository so that everyone can read it for free. And they're like, really? I can do that? And then I'm like, yeah,
Starting to think,
here's
oh,
how you
that's
do it.
brilliant. Yeah, because that happens all the time. I mean, and of course, I go to the library and I find the article for free and think, haha, I got around that. But the truth of the matter is, I love that as an intervention. You're so smart. Thank you.
Yeah, and the truth of the
Thanks,
matter is that still doesn't take care of the issue of Reggie and his colleagues being able to access this work in Cape Town, right? Necessarily. Like, it all depends on who has access to which databases and who's paying God knows how much money for those databases, which pretty soon universities just won't be able to afford.
Right. Right.
I do see a question from Gabby about the public access requirements. I don't think, I think that those requirements could be made in such a way that they, and I think some of them do, I don't know specific examples, but some of them will say that you have to publish in a journal that does not charge APCs, like a truly open access journal. But I don't think that that's a widespread requirement, and I can't speak to like the level of awareness in those funders about these sort of issues. But I think it's mostly just that. Mostly, I mention it as a way of pointing out the fact that publishers saw this as another opportunity to push paid open access. It's like if the funders are going to require open access, then we're going to tell people that, yeah, we'll do open access, but if you want to open right away, you got to pay for it. And so I think that funnels people into that model, and there's maybe a lack of awareness that the requirements is usually that some version gets made available within 12 months of publication, and so paying to publish open access right away is not necessary. It's not actually a requirement. It's just there are other means, but I don't think those means are presented or communicated to faculty very well, because it's not in the interest of publishers to do that.
Right.
They don't make any extra money off of it. And I'd be very curious to see, I don't know if such a thing exists out there yet. I'd be very curious to see some sort of examination of the amount of money paid in APCs versus like the average per article, like the amount of money that publishers make off of individual articles in their lifetime, because I bet the APCs are a lot higher, like than like individual article sales or anything like that.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't that it? The model we have right now basically is profitable to publishers because it is so, you know, what do I want to call it? Everything in it is so veiled. We'll never figure out any of that stuff. We won't know the actual economics of any of that until we become the publishers ourselves. And that's problematic because you don't want only Wayne State publishing only Wayne State stuff. So it needs to be a powerful enough coalition of publishers to be able to really ramp up and compete with commercial publishers. And of course, they're going to have the dollars to fight that. And that's what we're seeing is they just keep changing the model. You know, it's, yeah. I mean, it's the pretty typical response of let's just make this so muddy that there is no easy solution out of it for the other side. And it by and large works. So somehow we've got to think smarter than that. And
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate.
Greater minds than mine for a long time.
Well, yeah, and I think this is not something that librarians are like, or scholars, like academia is unique in that, you know, that these very large corporations exist and can just throw so much money at any problem they run into, that we're kind of, that we can't hope to compete with those amounts of funds in any way. But at least, I don't know, I take a little bit of hope in the fact that the Library Publishing Coalition is, I think, an attempt at that sort of broad coalition looking at publishing from a different angle. But, you know, again, it's mostly on the library side of things, and we're not getting, and not on the faculty side of things. Although one thing that I was going to say earlier that I forgot is that I think that one of the other ways we can do like a one-on-one intervention sort of thing is, you know, as long as if we're maintaining good relationships with our departments or with individuals in those departments, then at least we can have those more difficult conversations with them. Whereas I think, like you said, the emails that you get, this is the only time you've ever spoken with anybody, this person in your department saying, do you have some money for us?
Right.
You know, obviously it's not gonna land very well there.
Right.
You know. Well, so we've got the recording. Hopefully, folks, there will be people in the future that will watch it, perhaps. Yeah, but I thought, yes, I did see, I kept watching the numbers kind of drop off, and I recognize one of them was Virginia, who, you know, is also a library person. So, like, yeah, by and large, we need to be aware of these issues, but we're not the main change agents, or we can't be the main change agents of these issues. But I do appreciate everybody who came.
Well, I wouldn't be too discouraged about that. We actually are pretty well trusted, and because we don't have a financial stake in the game. And personally, I don't think we do, because I think the other things that we do will still keep us in the game by and large. But maybe we are the ones to get really active in it and, you know, promote. I would say promote a unified solution, more or less, that really did start to build ways that faculty clearly saw would benefit them, which is, you know, going to be the tricky part. But I don't know, now that the world's just been totally upended anyway, I feel like, hey, what else can we accomplish in the pandemic? Let's just do it. Maybe nobody's looking right now. Let's just do it. That was a really good presentation. It was thought-provoking. I like the overview because I felt like it brought me back to that big picture of we've lost our initial principles on this, is what's really happened with these various solutions. It was really good. I liked it, Clayton.
Yeah, and like I said, that was something pointed out by Reggie at a recent I didn't attend, but someone else did and then tweeted about it. It was something that was pointed out.
Yeah, that's cool. And I'm not familiar with any of his stuff, so I'm gonna go look him up too. So that's cool. Very cool.
Thanks, Clayton. I have a question for you, and I always try and make associations with stuff, and maybe I'm wrong, but in the late 80s, early 90s, the big thing about publishing was that authors were not being compensated for articles that appeared online. So do you think there's any relationship to any of the open access publishing and that? I mean, if somebody made an argument for authors to be compensated rather than the publishers, do you think that would change anything?
I mean, I think it would be very interesting. I haven't heard a whole lot about that.
Yeah, because I mean, it was a really big deal in the late 80s, early 90s about authors not being, stuff would appear in the aggregated services and authors were not being compensated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, and the fact that I'm like very aware of the fact that all of this profit that's coming to these large publishers is off of the effort and the intellectual property of faculty. So I don't know if changing where the money goes would affect anything, but I do think that reminders that that money is being made off of the intellectual property of faculty is very important. And faculty effort in general, because they're the ones who are doing peer review and the ones who are editing the journals as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have to be on reference.
Well, I appreciate you attending. Thank you, Jan.
Okay.
And Gabby and Karen, everybody. Have a good afternoon. I'm gonna go eat lunch.